Welcome to the Aspen Leading Edge podcast. I'm Patty Roberts from St. Mary's University School of Law, and today's guest is a fellow dean, the Dean and Provost Professor of Law, Colorado Law at the University of Colorado, Lolita Buckner Inniss. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Patty. This is a delight to be here.
Oh, I'm super excited to have you on, especially because of all the cool things happening at Colorado Law. But let's start with your role as the 17th dean, the second woman dean, and the first Black dean of the University of Colorado Law School. That is 17th dean. That's a lot of deans, but then the second and the first, that must be quite an experience to go in and be a change maker in filling this role for the university.
This is a tremendous experience. I was just speaking with some colleagues and fellow deans a little bit earlier today, and one of the things I said was that if you had approached me certainly 15 years ago and maybe even 10 years ago and asked, do you ever want to be dean? I would have said absolutely not. I think, though, as I reflect now on the job that I have, and I'm in my fourth year, this was probably a part of my unknown trajectory the whole time. And so it's exciting to have the potential to be a change maker. I think, though, this is the realization probably of all that I've wanted to accomplish in my career as a law professor. And so I find that cool. And in fact, being only in my fourth year, I've been a legal academic and professor far longer than I've had this leadership role. I think, though, that my time as a law professor closely and intensely governs how I think about this work. That means I agonize, for example, over decisions in ways that require me to think about how faculty and staff and students will be affected. And I think part of that approach comes from having spent so much of my time as an academic. And as for being the second woman and the first Black person, you know, Patty, I'm so tempted to say those things don't matter, but they do. And I'll say, let's start with that first perspective. Certainly, as a Black woman and as someone from a very much working class and even at times impoverished background, there's a way in which I've always been an outsider in this profession. I have not, and I do not see that as a disadvantage, frankly. I think it gives me the kind of perspective that causes me to ask questions about who's being affected, to ask questions about who has voice and who doesn't. I think most importantly, being the first Black dean and the second woman dean, it asks of me that I query every single day the difference between equity and equality. And I know that is a sort of maybe an over-discussed trope, especially in academic spaces, but that's real because I think for too long in my career, I didn't necessarily meet people's ideas of excellence. And so I would say 3 E's: equity, equality, and excellence, because it's a funny thing I say to my colleagues, and I don't think some of them are really laughing. I'm the dean at a school where, frankly, when I started out looking for a tenure track job, I couldn't have gotten an interview here. I didn't get one. It was only after having had a fairly successful career in some other places where, honestly, I might have been deemed the sort of scholar that was suited for this kind of space or similar spaces. And I think that's something that I want to change. I think it is possible to expand notions of excellence without doing away with rigor. And I am here to sort of make that manifest wherever I can, however I can, recognizing that deans don't do it all. We open conversations, we lead initiatives, we don't do it all. Our faculty really does that.
Absolutely. I consider we're like producers a lot of times. I appreciate your insight into having this role at this point in your career, and bravo to the schools who gave you a chance before then, right? That gave you the experience that this would be a natural next progression for you. I feel the same way, that there are places that gave me chances in certain roles that have led me here, but it's not necessarily been a natural progression. Sometimes you have to go round and round. But
that is right.
so you were where before you were at Colorado Law?
I was at SMU Dedman School of Law, where I served as the senior associate dean. And just a shout out to my former dean, Jennifer Collins, who is now the president at Rhodes College. Jennifer gave me a couple chances. First, in letting me come to SMU as a lateral, and next in letting me become the senior associate dean. I think both of those were opportunities that not only enriched my career, but really put me in a place to be where I am today. And that is a reminder to me of the difference sometimes that gender can make. I believe it to be the case that Jennifer, as I recall, was the first woman dean at SMU, and I can check that, but I think she was. And I think she came there with a particular vision that perhaps hadn't been held by other deans. And if it had been held, I don't think it was ever executed in quite the same way. I think it's fair to say that under Jennifer Collins, SMU, because of lateral hires, and I don't just mean me at all, I mean lots of other people, it changed and enriched the client, that coming of new people, both senior people, mid-level people, and then the junior people who ended up coming in. And looking back at that experience at SMU, it reminds me that yes, leadership matters, but also the rank and file, staff and faculty members, they matter tremendously in the shaping of a culture, especially what I'll call a healthy culture.
Absolutely. One of the things that we have here at St. Mary's is a number of retirements that we've had already and that we will have. It's just the nature of a place where you have faculty who are really happy in their position and at their place, and so they've worked for decades. So that can be a challenge, certainly. But it's also such an opportunity because you get to get some new excitement and enthusiasm and build a really healthy, happy culture.
Mhm.
Well, Jennifer Collins was a dean when I was a dean, when I was a baby dean here in Texas. And this is my 5th year, so I'm not very far ahead of you. And she was really wonderful. What a great role model. And I've talked to her since she's been president of Rhodes, and boy, they're lucky to have her.
Yes.
All right, let's talk a little bit more about Colorado law. So you have been in the news, or the University of Colorado has been in the news quite a bit these last couple of years because you have a very famous and successful coach there now. Coach Prime, Deion Sanders, has joined you, and boy, he has really put himself and Colorado on the map with that position and with your team. And so tell us a little bit about what kind of impact that's had, not only in the University of Colorado, but also on the law school.
Wow. Well, thank you for that question. Let me just first say, Deion Sanders, Coach Prime, just coach for some of us, has had the sort of impact that I think relatively few of us would have anticipated. So yes, there's the campus, I think, impact, there's the law school impact, but let me say more broadly, just the town and the region. I think economists, for example, have estimated that Coach Prime, because of the kind of energy that he has generated, is probably responsible for millions and millions of dollars in revenue because of visitors and because of the people who have engaged with this region. And I don't think anyone could have anticipated that.
That is
Now,
amazing.
it is amazing. Now, caveat, I don't typically follow college football, and I suppose it may have been the case elsewhere that when you get a really dynamic, charismatic coach of a sport that could happen. That all may be true, but I think most of us probably didn't anticipate the impact it would have. I mean, for example, with the undergraduate program, we have had an enormous, overwhelming uptick in applications, which some of us are saying is due to what we call the prime effect. I think students and probably their families want to be a part of that atmosphere. We have even seen some significant growth in our law school applications, believe it or not. And I say believe it or not because maybe most law students typically aren't that engaged with things like campus sports. However, a number of students are very excited by Coach Prime. We even had the great good fortune to have Coach Prime over to speak with us shortly after he took up his job here on campus. And I have to say that is largely due to one of our recent graduates, Essence Duncan, who sort of forged a relationship with him in writing because they'd both gone to the same undergraduate school. And so when Essence invited him, he came. We were really happy. He lectured to the students, that's the wrong word. He spoke to the students over a lunch period during which, first of all, I learned a few things about Coach Prime. Not only is he dynamic and charismatic, I would venture to say he's a brilliant man in the sense that he understands people, he understands what they need to hear to be motivated. And so one might say, how can Coach Prime motivate a room full of law students? Question, answer, he can do that because he understands the kind of language, the approach that people need to feel ready and willing to go out there and go to a higher level in their work. And I thought, oh my gosh, I get it now if I didn't get it before. We are tremendously lucky to have him. The other thing that Coach Prime's coming has engendered, certainly among many of our law students, is an interest in name, image, likeness work, that it's to say, looking at, for example, the legal aspects of how athletes, and especially student athletes, might be able to monetize their name, image, likeness, or any other attribute that they have. As you're probably aware, and as I think probably a lot of our listeners are aware, it's only in recent years that student athletes have been able to take advantage of being paid for those sort of personal attributes. And now that it's possible, what we see here at Colorado, here at the University of Colorado Boulder more broadly, is because we have a team that's generating a lot of interest, because we have a lot of stars on that team, naturally, a lot of those athletes have name, image, likeness deals. However, I think it's fair to say that virtually every athlete now at Colorado Law is more interested in garnering those opportunities for themselves. And what that has meant is that those students need more and more legal help. And so enter our law students. I think responding to the interest of our students, and to some extent to the needs of campus athletes, we have started some name, image, likeness programming. So this fall, we started a seminar where some students are learning the fundamentals. And then in the spring, they'll do a practicum where they'll actually get to have some clients, most of whom will probably be our campus athletes. And again, I attribute that to Coach Prime, because again, there is an extent to which, sure, those opportunities would have been available to students, at least more in the abstract, had Coach Prime not been here. But I think his presence has made more manifest the real possibilities that student athletes, even those in the least known sports, that student athletes have these opportunities.
That is so exciting for your students.
It is. They are delighted as far as I can tell.
Well, and I'm sure that Coach Prime's impact on your football team has made you a college football fan.
It is absolutely, oh my gosh, Betty, you cannot believe I'm watching games and checking scores. And I was really fortunate to be present at our homecoming game a few weeks ago, where we had this, frankly, it felt like a miraculous win. And over the course of 11 seconds at the end, we sort of just turned it around in a way that few people believed we would. Now I believed, because that's the other thing, and maybe that's part of the secrets of my success, or at least it's a trait. I do believe in magic a little bit. And I'll say this, yes, I think it's okay for me to say, generally and broadly speaking, I'm a person of faith. I think a lot of us are, regardless of what you believe in, but I'm also somebody that believes a little bit in magic, because there are times in our lives when give it your all, you do your best, you have every possible resource, and still things might not look good, but you just keep going. That's what sports can do. I think it's not just the sport sort of granular effect that it has. I think it's a way of encouraging us to keep trying our hardest. I think it teaches perseverance and patience, and maybe in good old-fashioned sportsmanship. There is still such a thing. I believe in that. I mean, so there are really some ways that I think sports and sporting events do resemble the legal endeavor that we're doing over here.
Certainly the discipline, right? The hard work and the discipline.
The hard work and the discipline. And that's the thing. And I'll go back to Coach Prime. I think too many people who sort of only focus on the sound bites are thinking, oh, he's a well-known athlete. Oh, Coach Prime is Coach Prime because of years of hard work, discipline, and perseverance. And those are the traits I think that he is instilling, not just in his student athletes. I think it becomes symbolic for more of us across the campus.
Well, I love that for you. And I love when I see posts on social media of you at the games. That must be so fun.
Oh, it is tremendous. I mean, we go to the games where we're often accompanied by a lot of our friends and our alumni and our donors. And it's just a wonderful opportunity to enjoy some fellowship around something that is really just sort of good old-fashioned fun, right?
Excellent. Well, in addition to your NIL practicum and course that you're now providing for your students, more and more law schools nationally are no longer ignoring our undergraduate populations. And so I wonder if you can share a little bit about what Colorado Law may be doing to help your undergraduates.
For the past, I would say at least for the past decade, I've been really excited about the possibilities of teaching legal content to undergraduates. And that largely stems from a 2-year distinguished visit I had at Hamilton College in Clinton, New York, about a decade ago, where I was teaching property law to undergraduate students. I think when I was invited to do that, I thought, oh my gosh, this is daunting. Property's hard enough for anybody, much less for undergraduates. But that really gave me an opportunity to create content that was more digestible, that was more direct, that captured and retained the complexity, but also was more meaningful for undergraduates. And that was such a wonderful experience that I knew that once I got a deanship, if I ever did, it would be something I would want to support. And so here at Colorado Law this year, we are offering a class called Introduction to Law for our undergraduate students. And those students meet with some of our best professors, and they do that right here in the building at the law school. And so I'm delighted that so many undergrads are getting this opportunity, because I think first and foremost, even if those students never go to law school, I think it's an invaluable experience, number one. Number two, and I was reminded of this when I was at Hamilton about a decade ago, I think a lot of us forget that the study of law in the US, at the point where it became an academic endeavor as opposed to just reading law with a practitioner, which people did that a long time. But when it first became an academic endeavor, it was largely an undergraduate endeavor. Places had law schools that nobody remembers. Like there's always these sort of famous obscure articles about Princeton Law School. That's kind of a joke because Princeton is an Ivy that right now doesn't have a law school. But you know what? They once did.
That I didn't know.
Most people don't know that. It lasted about a half a dozen years. The teachers were some of the most famous jurists, certainly in New Jersey and probably in the country at that time. And that was pretty common. I mean, there were legal studies at Hamilton. I think most legacy or historic colleges and universities had legal studies departments that were teaching this material. So it is not a new thing, I think, to be willing and able to teach law to undergraduates. Now, I don't necessarily anticipate that it would ever once again become entirely an undergraduate endeavor. I do think, though, the time is ripe for undergraduates to be able to get more explicit content of the sort that they would get in law schools. Because I'll say this too, one of the things I loved about teaching law to undergraduates at Hamilton was those students they're at a different point in their developmental journey as students. They are so rapt, they are so attentive, and perhaps most importantly, the stakes are different when you're an undergraduate. We know what law schools are like. I mean, it's a very narrowly created program. If this were offered in undergraduate schools, I think it would prepare students not just for law school, if they ever went, but also for life more generally. Just things like understanding the complexities of, for example, our civic culture. Some of us, the last time we learned anything about, for example, the tripartite government and how a bill becomes law, you know what? Yeah, a lot of us talked about that in the 8th grade, and that could be the last time for some. Maybe it was 10th grade. I think that offering law to undergraduates is a way of creating and enhancing what I call the culture of citizen advocacy. And so they might never come to law school, but I think that is something that is badly needed in today's undergraduates. So I'm really excited that we can provide that content.
That's an excellent way to look at it, to think about you're teaching better citizens either way, right?
Either way, yeah.
Yeah, well, excellent. I'm glad you're doing that. And do you get in the classroom too? Are you?
Not yet, but I'm planning to. I mean, and I mean, I'll probably just make a cameo and say a few things. You know, I haven't taught since becoming dean, and I keep looking forward to doing it. I mean, odds are in upcoming semesters, I will probably do something in intersession that's short and discreet so that I can sort of get in and get out. But I do miss that part of my life as a legal scholar.
Wholeheartedly agree, but boy, is there hardly time to carve.
It is really hard. It's really hard to have time to do that.
One of the things I wanted to mention was your involvement in women in legal education. So you are president of the Women in Legal Education section of AALS this year. And I know that you have done some scholarship alongside Professor Bridget Crawford, on issues that involve, in addition to Black Lives Matter and other social movements, Me Too, of course, a women's movement. So if you'll share with us a little bit about your work in the Women in Legal Education section, and then how some of your scholarship reflects that work and priority.
Thank you so much. Well, let's talk a little bit about the Women in Legal Education section. That section is at this point decades old. And one of the things that I hear from people who were around 30 years ago or so or more is that it's perhaps not surprising to reflect on the fact that women as law professors, as legal leaders in legal academia, women were scarcely present, let's say, in the 80s and the 90s. And the Women in Legal Education section was meant to be a space where women law teachers and or people who were interested in the issues that affected women law teachers, it was a place where they could gather, where they could think about their teaching, their service, their scholarship, and I think more broadly, their lives as women in the legal academy. And so the Women in Legal Education section started out probably relatively small because there weren't necessarily always a lot of women in the legal academy. Reflect on the fact that now I think there are over 2,000 members of that section, which, given the quite finite number of law professors who are under the umbrella of AALS, that's actually quite a lot of people. They're not all women, of course. People have all sorts of gender identities, but lots of people care about the issues that affect women and women-identified people. Being the head of that section this year is sort of a natural outgrowth to the interest that I've had in the role of gender and specifically looking at women in legal education. And for me, that's been a journey that I've taken in tandem with thinking about issues of race. So if you were to characterize a lot of my scholarship over the course of my career, a lot of it has had to do with race and or gender, and more typically the combination of the two. If I were going to describe myself right now, or the work that I've done maybe the last decade, I would probably call myself a legal historian, in the sense that I almost always frame my scholarly work by looking back at the way that legal norms have been created, shaped, how they're sustained. And that actually is sort of what led me to work with Bridget Crawford on the book that we have coming out really soon. We expect it in the bookstores probably, certainly before the end of the calendar year, and probably before. Social movements and the law. Wow, what are we? At this point, it's been about 7 years since Bridget and I started thinking about the role of specifically Black Lives Matter and Me Too, how those two social movements, how they came about, how they have been shaping law and culture, and how they related to each other. And that work that Bridget and I have been doing, and actually when I go back to my relationship with Bridget, it's a lot older than our book. I think I met Bridget long ago, probably for the first time at an AALS Women in Legal Education mid-year conference, which Colorado Law hosted in October after a long hiatus of that conference. But Bridget and I have known each other a long time. And I remember the first time I could work closely with her was actually when I was visiting at her school at Pace back in, I think it was 2008 or 2009. We were coming home. She was giving me a ride from a women law students event because we were both always interested in gender issues. And we started kicking around some topic. And we said, hey, we should write an article. Now, you know, Patty, when a lot of people say that, you go, yeah, that's a good idea. Well, you know what? That was like Friday night or Saturday. Monday, Bridget comes into my office. She was then the associate dean at Pace and goes, okay, we're ready to write the article. And so we did. That really characterizes Bridget Crawford. She is intense and focused and gets things done. And this work around gender, and especially women, is something that I think has come naturally to her and to me. And so when we took this work up, we really were doing it at the start of our research and writing, and we brought in a lot of other scholars. We were doing it at a time when social movements like Black Lives Matter and Me Too had so much presence in the media and in just public life. What's fascinating to me is that, yeah, like I said, we're less than 10 years in. We're 7 years since we started having those first conversations, 7 years since this was in the media every day. And what we find is that the salience of those two movements, both Black Lives Matter and Me Too, that they've gotten much more muted, but that makes them no less important in terms of how they've shaped our approaches to law and how we think about law and legal norms. So, for example, if you think about some of the famous media and entertainment figures who've been in the news around issues of things like sexual abuse, partner abuse, I think we're having some of those conversations largely because there has been a Me Too movement. As for Black Lives Matter, one of the interesting things that I think if we were to draw some conclusions from our work, is that Black Lives Matter hasn't had nearly the more pervasive positive reception. And so one of the things we talk about in the book is why some of the people who created that movement, some of the people who have promoted some of the norms of inclusion that movement called for, why has that not been as successful? I mean, we talk about that. And yet I would still say that Black Lives Matter has caused a change in what I would call the small L legal culture. That is to say, the regulatory regimes by which people govern themselves and their day-to-day lives among their neighbors. That's how Black Lives Matter, I think, has sort of had importance in the legal culture, in the broader legal culture. And I say that, for example, as someone who, at least, probably for most of my professional life, I've lived and worked in communities that were largely white. I think the way that I'm received in those communities, the way that people may be more thoughtful about how they think about and talk about issues around race and especially around Blackness, that's different. And I can say that after having lived decades in these kinds of communities, that's different. Black Lives Matter does matter in terms of how it shapes the legal culture in the broadest sense, even if I think it hasn't had quite the same explicit benefits that the Me Too movement has. And so those are the kinds of things that we've talked about. And we're really eager to see this book used by, for example, undergraduate populations. Because going back to what we
Oh,
said,
yeah, that'd be great.
it would be
Group.
wonderful
Yeah.
because I think it is an approachable way of thinking about the way that formal law is shaped, and at the same time that it invites readers to think about how law is not just what the courts or the legislatures do. Law is what you and I do every day. And so, yes, there's a trickle down with law. We get legal pronouncements. There's also a trickle up. Culture, social norms matter.
Well, I love that thoughtful explanation of how you approach the book and the impact that you think those movements are having. I hope that is true. I hope that they continue to echo across our cultures and move up so that we have changes in the law, as you indicate. But that's forthcoming book, Social Movements and the Law, with Bridget Crawford, coming out from the University of California Press. Well, we have had a terrific conversation, but before we conclude, I want to ask you the question I ask all my guests, and that is what your predictions are for the future of legal education in the coming decade. You know, an easy one.
Wow, that's a big question, Patty. That's a big question. And I'll tell you, well, I guess I should say it's not as big as the question that I've been thinking about since I became dean. I'm sure that you, like me, are often invited to community groups, et cetera, to sort of think about or to share your broad vision of legal education. And so I started talking about something that I call Law School 2123. And that was last year. Not a typo, I told people, meaning when I think about where we are right now in terms of the nature of legal education and how it's being carried out, maybe as a legal historian, maybe that's why I do this. I look backwards to where we were 100 years ago, and then I sort of work forward in increments. So if you looked 100 years ago at legal education, you would see a lot of things. You would see that we were really just getting comfortable, for example, with offering law as a graduate discipline. As I just said earlier, a lot of it had been undergraduate, number one. Number two, we were making law school attendance much more scholarly and much more, I would say, social scientific, in the sense that we had legal methods by then. I mean, there was sort of a prescribed curriculum and ways of dealing with the material. All of that was in place. And the other thing that was in place, law was largely a white and male endeavor in terms of, and that was true both in the classrooms and outside of it. Well, if you fast forward that 100 years, it's very different now. And let's just talk about the perspective of gender, because that's something I think about a lot. At the beginning of the 20th century, women as law students were about 5%. I mean, and there are virtually no women in legal leadership. You'd be hard pressed to have found any. Very few women law professors, though there had been some by then. By the beginning of the 20th century, and certainly by now, let's look at today, in 2024, over 55% of law students are women. And here at Colorado Law, we're over 60%. So to your question, what does that mean for 10 years from now?
Oh, wow. Over 60%.
Over
Wow.
60% of our student body are women, people who identify themselves as women. Now, again, being neutral, social scientific, people who like to reason from the facts and who like to stick closely to text, all that being true, we'd like to say gender doesn't matter, but of course it does. I predict that if this trend continues, with women being larger and larger numbers of law school classes, that is going to affect the ways that we think about law, both in what we're teaching and in terms of what our expectations and hopes are for students going outside after they complete our education. Because one of the interesting things about law school, and I say this all the time to my fellow deans here on the CU Boulder campus, yes, we're an academic program, we're a scholarly program, we are also, horrors, a vocational program, in the sense that significant numbers of students come here to train themselves to take up a specific, albeit scholarly, vocational activity. And that means that a lot of what we do, whether we like it or not, must be focused on the lives that students are able to have after they leave us. And that means 10 years from now, if the numbers, even if the numbers stay the same and we've got 55, 60% of women, we have to think about what that is going to mean on the provision of legal services. And I don't think it's going to be that we're going to educate them business as usual and then send them out into a world that's rapidly changing because of gender. We're going to make those changes within the building. So for example, I think there may be more clinical classes because traditionally in a lot of schools, clinical classes have been spaces where a lot of women, a lot of people of color, people who are not historically the people found present in law schools. Those have been spaces where people are more comfortable. Those have been spaces where people who might not have seen as much immediate success in the podium classroom, they can often demonstrate not just competence, but excellence. So I imagine there'd be more of that. I think there would be, and this has already been happening, there'd be less and less of that old school Professor Kingsfield kind of terrify them and cold call on them. And more of us have moved away from that. But I think the increasing presence of women students has meant an even faster move away from that. And so 10 years from now, I highly doubt there would be as many people teaching materials in that way. And let me go on and say, of course, with this many women in law school, I predict many more women teaching in law schools. I mean, right now,
Amen, right?
and that's going to change. That's
Yeah.
going to change things, just like the difference that you and I make, Patty, as deans of law school. Our seeing more women on faculties providing legal education to students is also going to make a difference. And whether people wish to think about it or not, I think gender most definitely, as does race and other identifiers, sexual identity, these shape your perspective and how you approach materials. I don't think it means less rigor. It might even mean more rigor, but I think more rigor in ways that are more accessible, because I think that's also been one of my constant themes here. People say, despite the times they're in, oh, do you really believe in diversity, equity, inclusion? I do. I also believe in an additional E, the excellence piece. I don't think that's separate. I think you not only can you have rigor and diversity, equity, and inclusion, you must have rigor. The question becomes how we define things like rigor and excellence. I mean, I often say, and I don't know, I think I say it with a bit of humor and self-deprecation. I'm the dean at a place where in the late 90s, I couldn't even get an interview for an entry-level job here. Some people told me, well, you know, your credentials aren't what they should be. Translation, I did not attend 2 Ivies. I did attend 1. You would have thought that would be enough, but no. But it was not an Ivy law school. I mean, there for a long time, there were very specific ideas about the sort of background that someone who could be a law professor should have. There were specific ideas about the kind of scholarship that could be deemed rigorous or excellent. There were specific ideas about how, whether or not teaching was excellent, depending upon the methodology that you embraced. Those things are changing, and they're changing fast because of the presence of women in these spaces and because of the presence of women and people who have all sorts of diverse identities. So 10 years from now, law school will be different. It will still be rigorous. It will still be challenging. It will also be a space where excellence is being not just, it won't just have a new definition. I think it will be continuously redefined, and that's what's been missing. We've been sort of sitting on a tuffet of sort of excellence that hasn't changed in a very long time. And I think in 10 years we will understand that we have to keep reinterrogating.
Stuffy excellence. That
Yes.
tuffet has stuffy excellence.
Stuffy, very narrow visions of what that means. Very narrow, and I'm really pleased to see how those changes are being made manifest just by the people who are now in these spaces.
What a brilliant answer. And in all of the interviews that I have done, the only one that addressed that changing demographic and how it will impact a change in legal education, and already is. You mentioned clinicians. I was a clinician by trade. 10, 20 years ago, I never would have been a dean. That just wouldn't have happened. So they are a-changing.
They are changing so much. And similarly, I mean, I started my career as a legal writing teacher. Then I was a clinician. Only then did I get to podium teaching. And that was a journey that I have to say I'm really thankful for, because it really shapes my leadership. It shapes my understanding of this whole endeavor called law school.
Completely agree. Well, thank you so much, Dean Lolita Buckner Inniss, for telling us more about Colorado law and your scholarship. It's been a pleasure to talk with you. And for those of you who enjoyed listening to this interview, I hope that you will listen to additional Aspen Leading Edge podcast episodes. You can find them on the Aspen Leading Edge podcast webpage or where you find your other favorite podcasts. Thank you.
Thank you so much.